All right, hello everyone. My name is Amos Christian Wilson, or A.C. Wilson is what I've published my books under. I am the author of the Grimdark tetralogy, which is My Father's Land, My Father's Ghost, My Father's God, and then upcoming My Father's Will. And today I'm here to talk about one of my all-time favorite fantasy authors, Joe Abercrombie. So we'll just start with some introduction. What books has Joe Abercrombie written? What is his corpus of literature, shall we say? So first off, you have his flagship series, which is In the World of the First Law. It is 9 novels and then 1 collection of short stories. And it is set in 3 trilogies. So you have the first trilogy, which is the First Law trilogy. And then you have the second trilogy, which is the Great Leveler trilogy. Then you have Sharp Ends, his collection of short stories. And then finally finishing it off with the Age of Madness trilogy. Although there's potential for this world to expand even further. So I hope he does expand this series. This is like peak grimdark fantasy as far as just like what you're getting into. It's epic, it's grim, it's cynical, and we love it. Then you have his Viking-inspired fantasy, which is The Shattered Sea. That's a really fun series. And then you have his standalone book, a standalone currently, although it looks like he's going to probably write a whole trilogy based off of this, The Devils. And this is alternate history, vaguely similar to our medieval period. So those are his books. And let me start off also by just giving you when you're reading a Joe Abercrombie book, there's going to be basically 3 things you can depend on. He's got a very distinct writing style, and these 3 things are in all of his books, and I love them. And these 3 things, I think, are one of the reasons I keep coming back to Joe Abercrombie. And even when he writes a book that other people don't like as much, like The Devils, I still loved it because of these 3 things. First off, Joe Abercrombie is writing grim, dark fantasy. He gets into kind of darker topics, some troubling subject matter, but he does so in a way that doesn't necessarily glorify the darkness. Oftentimes they're actually really funny the way he writes these things. He tends to be very cynical and not have a very high view of humanity in general. A big question that he constantly is evaluating is, can people actually change? Which is a really interesting topic. And again, he's pretty cynical about it. So that's one thing you can always expect when you're reading a Joe Abercrombie book. The next thing you can always expect in a Joe Abercrombie book is, to date, he has only ever written with a limited third-person point of view. So this really forces you as the reader to get inside these characters' heads. And since Abercrombie already just excels at writing fun characters, sometimes his characters are like bigger and larger than life, but otherwise they feel really grounded. They feel really relatable. Even when they're villainous characters, you just love listening to their interdialogue. And the way that, since Abercrombie restricts himself to this limited third-person POV, you're forced to really see the world through these characters' eyes, and it makes for this really character-centered look at story. And I love that. Characters are why I read. I'm not at all subtle about that fact. I love strong characters, a strong character voice, and Abercrombie delivers all the time. Even when he's maybe a little bit bombastic with his characters, he's still always grounding his narratives with his characters, and I love that. Finally, the third thing that you're going to get in Joe Abercrombie books all the time is what I like to call mundane world building. So instead of giving you these big lore dumps or like 100-year history of these kingdoms, he's just going to tell you the way it is currently, which is more real to life about the way we inhabit our world. Most of us, unless you're a history nerd like me, are not concerned about who won a battle 100 years ago. We're much more concerned about the mundane aspects of our world, like how waste is disposed of. Or what day of the week it is. And Abercrombie does an excellent job of telling epic stories in this way, where they're big, epic narratives, but he's centered it on these very mundane aspects of world building, and I love that. So, that's a little bit about Joe Abercrombie. If you're interested, the question is, where do you start? Where is the best place to start Joe Abercrombie? My recommendation, and this might be a little bit controversial, But I recommend if you're going to start Joe Abercrombie, start with The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. This is a lighter book. It's not as serious as some of his other books. It's not as dark as some of his other books. The plot is a little bit predictable. And especially if you know how Abercrombie writes characters and a lot of the ways he does story arcs, you're going to find this very predictable. However, if you haven't read anything else by Joe Abercrombie, you're probably going to find this really enjoyable. This is like a fast-paced Dungeons and Dragons style novel. And it's so much fun. This is a book that I basically read with a bowl of cereal because, again, it's not super deep. It's just fun. And as a introduction to Joe Abercrombie, just to kind of get a feel for his writing style, this is a great place to start. Then, my next recommendation of the next book to go to, but honestly, this would also be a great place to start Joe Abercrombie, is a book of his that I think is way underhyped, and that is Half a King. Half a King starts off the Shattered Sea trilogy, and Half a King, in my opinion, is one of Joe Abercrombie's best books, period. Not only is it just such a good book, the narrative is so much fun, the twists and turns in this book left my jaw on the floor. But also it's just a great entry point to Joe Abercrombie. It's less challenging than some of his other books. It's less dark than some of his other books. His protagonist, while still being a little bit morally complicated, is an easy character to root for. This reads as like a epic Viking saga where the protagonist, Yarvi, has had an injustice done to him and he's out for revenge. So it's really easy to get behind him. It's really easy to root for him. And then the journey is just a roller coaster. So Half a King, again, one of my favorite Abercrombie books and an excellent place to start, especially after seeing more of his just fun side in The Devils. You get lots of fun in this book, but also a lot of thought-provoking concepts. And then you can continue with the Shattered Sea trilogy if you want. Now, this is where it gets complicated. And so the next book in the Shattered Sea trilogy is going to be Half a World. And then you finish the trilogy off with Half a War. I actually don't recommend reading this trilogy in chronological order. And the reason for that is that this trilogy ends on a rather anticlimactic note. Half a War is very anticlimactic. And especially after seeing just a lot of the fun, really cool ideas that Abercrombie is playing with, it's a letdown to end it with Half a War. So I actually recommend reading this trilogy out of order. Read Half a King first, then read Half a War, and then finish it off with the second book, Half the World. You are going to get a spoiler for book 2 if you read book 3 first, but honestly, I think it actually enhances book 2 to know that spoiler going into it. It makes the story so much more fun. And reading it out of order also, because book 2 has such a strong ending, it kind of counteracts the anticlimactic ending of the third book. So that might be controversial, but that's my recommendation. That leaves us with nothing but Abercrombie's flagship series, the 9 or 10 books in the World of the First Law. So obviously start this at the beginning. Start this with the First Law trilogy. And frankly, if you're not going to read anything else by Joe Abercrombie, read the First Law trilogy. This trilogy is just such an influential piece of fiction. Like, as far as like most impactful pieces of modern fantasy, this trilogy's on that list. Easily top 5 most influential modern fantasy series. The First Law trilogy is on that list. So that's The Blade itself, Before They Are Hanged, and The Last Argument of Kings. Now, this series, again, you've got the 3 hallmark Abercrombie, Grimdark, tight, limited third-person point of view characters, and clever, mundane world building. You've got all that in this book, but this series also is a lot more thoughtful than a lot of his other series. Even later books in the series, I don't feel like are quite as thoughtful as this original trilogy. Although I think narratively, this trilogy is actually one of Abercrombie's weakest, even though that this gets so much hype. Because he was still learning as an author, and I think he perfects his craft as he moves forward in this trilogy. But this trilogy especially, Abercrombie is playing with the idea of the hero's journey and basically twisting every trope of the hero's journey on its head. And so in in one sense, this feels like a very familiar epic fantasy story. There's, these big epic quests that the characters are going on, and it feels like Lord of the Rings almost. But at every turn, he's flipping these tropes on its head, and so it really makes you think. It's a little bit of a depressing series. No spoilers for the ending, but I felt very dissatisfied by the time they came to the end because of kind of these cynical and depressing ideas that Abercrombie was playing with. But I did overall love this trilogy. And again, if you're not going to read anything else by Joe Abercrombie, read this trilogy. That then takes us into the next trilogy in the world of the First Law, and that is the Great Leveler series, the Great Leveler trilogy, excuse me. This trilogy, each of these books is a standalone novel. I recommend reading these in order, but technically you wouldn't have to. So that starts off with Best Served Cold. This is like a fast-paced Dungeons and Dragons style adventure where our heroine is searching for justice. So this is probably the least thought-provoking of any of the books in the First Law series. And especially if you already kind of know Abercrombie's way of writing characters, this book can feel a little bit predictable. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I would easily put it on par with The Devils as far as just a fun, fast-paced action-adventure, grimdark fantasy. Then you have where I think Abercrombie started taking some fun risks with the way he was telling stories, and I think it paid off. The Heroes is the next book in the Great Leveler, and this book basically is it's a thick book, and basically this entire book is just one battle sequence. And Abercrombie is playing with his narrative structure so much in this book. He's took a lot of risks narratively in how he told the story, and I think it paid off in a major way. This book is my third favorite Abercrombie book, just because of how creative the narrative structure is and how he told the story to bring this battle to life. I loved it. And then finally, my all-time favorite Abercrombie book, Red Country. This is the final book in the Great Leveler trilogy, and it's almost a Western, but it also is playing with the inspirations from the expeditions of Francisco Pizarro and Hernando Cortez, which I'm obsessed with those historical events. And so to have them referenced in such a fun way in this just phenomenal Western fantasy, I loved it so much. And this book, I feel like, is where Abercrombie begins to experiment with how he's telling characters' stories. Just the way he does the characters' arcs. In all of his other books, with the exception of the Shattered Sea trilogy. He's got a very predictable way of telling character story arcs that tend to be very cynical and a little bit depressing. And this is the book where he actually gives us a little bit more of a hopeful take on humanity. That's probably the reason I liked it the most, because we finally get to see like characters who do change, and who actually are motivated predominantly by honor and by morality, as opposed to, most of the characters in this book, just like most of Abercrombie's characters, are not motivated by honor and morality. So it's refreshing to see a couple of them who actually do change for the better. Red Country, in case you can't tell, I'm obsessed. This is my all-time favorite Abercrombie book. Then you have his series of short stories, The Sharp Ends. Honestly, you could skip this. You do not have to read The Sharp Ends. Mostly it fills in a lot of kind of not even gaps in the narrative, but kind of fills in some flashbacks from the First Law trilogy and a little bit from the Great Leveler trilogy. Just kind of gives you more insight into these characters. I had a lot of fun, but you don't have to read Sharp Ends. And that closes us out with Abercrombie's magisterial Age of Madness, A Little Hatred, The Trouble with Peace, and The Wisdom of Crowds. These book series are phenomenal. I think Abercrombie's really matured as an author, and you can see it in this trilogy. He's kind of fixing a lot of his narrative quirks from the First Law. He's kind of bringing in inspiration of both cynically looking at characters who don't change, but also having characters who genuinely do change. And I loved having that take. I really feel like you can see Abercrombie looking at humanity in a mature way in the series, being honest with how difficult change is, both on a human level and on an institutional level. And I loved it. I loved this. This is probably one of my top fantasy series of all time. My only critique of this trilogy is that I think Abercrombie, I mean, he's taking from a lot of real world inspiration. And I think he maybe took it a little bit too far. Like the first book is very much a retelling of the Luddites. The second book is very much a retelling of the Magna Carta. And then the third book is obviously just a straight up retelling of the French Revolution. To the point that I could predict plot moments that were going to happen based off, because I was so familiar with these historical events. So I found it predictable, not in a narrative sense, but because he was copying the history so closely, especially in the third book. I think he was pulling a little bit too much directly from the French Revolution and wasn't letting himself expand and tell his own story quite as much. That's a really minor criticism, because these are just phenomenal books, and the reveals he has at the end of this trilogy that reshaped the entire series, all 9 books previous, was phenomenal, and I loved it. So that is a book, honestly, I'm recommending reading it last of all of Joe Abercrombie's corpus, and it's so worth the wait because the payoff is phenomenal. So that is Joe Abercrombie. That's all of his books. And that's what I love about Abercrombie. So let me know, leave me some comments. Tell me what you think. Have you read Joe Abercrombie? What you like about him? What do you not like about him? Do you disagree with any of my takes? I did have some kind of controversial takes in this video. And I'd love to hear from other Joe Abercrombie fans if you would agree or disagree with them. So let's sort it out. Let's fight it out in the comments.